The race to the Dan in midwinter, and again, it was a very cold winter, 1780, 1781. In fact, in February, Greene wrote to Washington, "The miserable situation of the troops has rendered the march the most painful imaginable. Several hundred of soldiers marking the ground with their bloody feet. However, our army's in good spirits, notwithstanding their sufferings and excessive fatigue." Now, once he successfully crossed the Dan River, he was able to get reinforcements, let his army rest. Cornwallis, not being able to cross the Dan, turned back, and Greene and Morgan let him go, but then shortly thereafter, the vanguard of the revitalized Continental Army in the South crossed the Dan, and in the vanguard was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee. Cornwallis had gone from being the hunter to the hunted. And just as Morgan had chosen his battleground at Cowpens, so Greene chose his battleground at Guilford Courthouse. In fact, he devised a plan that was very much like Morgan's. It didn't work out quite as well. It was a heated battle, an hour and a half, and at one point, Greene withdrew his army from the field because he knew it was more important to keep his army together than to keep a piece of terrain. This is one of those men who seldom won a battle, but he won the war in the South by keeping his army together. Cornwallis held the field, but it was a costly victory for him. He lost another fourth of his men at Guilford Courthouse. In Parliament, analogies were made to the classic battle, the Pyrrhic victory, another such victory, and we are undone. In the space of 2 months, the British Army in the South has been reduced by more than half. And ladies and gentlemen, it is already a beaten army. Cornwallis is giving up on the Carolinas. His biographers called Guilford Courthouse a victory, but then add, so dearly bought that Cornwallis could never resume the offensive again in the Carolinas. He begins a 3-week retreat to Wilmington on the coast, and from there he wrote a colleague, "I assure you that I'm quite tired of marching about the countryside in search of adventures." However, being the good political general that he was, he had a plan. Writing to Clinton, he said, "All we've got to do is I'll move my army into Virginia, you bring down all those folks from New York, we'll again come to Virginia, and we take Virginia, the war will be over." Well, he had hoped that Greene would follow him into Virginia, and then they'd have another battle. Greene didn't do that. He turned back to South Carolina. And at Hobkirk Hill, which is near Camden, there was a vicious fight between the new Southern Army and the British there near Camden. It was pretty much a draw, but again, those in South Carolina that were supposed to hold the territory for the king could ill afford their losses. Every man lost was a man that could not be replaced. And even though they won at Hobkirk Hill, technically, 3 days later, or 4 days later, they abandoned Camden and ordered the evacuation of most of their posts in the interior. Greene decides that it would be a good idea for Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter, and Henry Lee and their mobile forces to move around the region and pick off outposts one by one. And they did, from Augusta to Orangeburg to Fort Mott to Georgetown. Greene had several more battles in the South. The siege of 96. He was on the cusp of success when word arrived of British reinforcements coming from Charleston. So once again, he withdrew to save his army. And then for the summer, he took a respite. It was nice to take an R&R back in those days. You could do it in the winter, you could do it in the summer. He chose the summer to be in the high hills of the Santee, which were elevated territory, healthful, for his army to recoup, re-equip, and get larger. But then he moves back into South Carolina towards Charleston in the fall and at Utah Springs, he commands what really is one of the hottest battles of the war. His men, once again, initially take the field, then they become disorderly, looking really for more equipment, both Continentals but especially militia. But Greene, once again, withdraws his forces, and after the Battle of Utah Springs, the British are pretty much confined to an enclave in and around Charleston. In North Carolina, there's a fierce 4-hour militia battle at Lindley's Mill between Patriots and Tories. The governor of North Carolina, the Patriot governor, has been captured by some Tory militia. And at Lindley's Mill, the Patriots are trying to save him. They don't, and they take him on down to Wilmington. So you've got fortified enclaves at Wilmington, at Savannah, and in Charleston. And because you do have these enclaves, there are always skirmishes. There's fighting going on all the time because the British are sending foraging parties into the countryside. Meanwhile, back to Lord Cornwallis, he moves north to Virginia. He waits until he hears what's happening to Greene in South Carolina. He hears about Hobkirk Hill, which was reported to him as a tremendous victory. So South Carolina is safe, he thinks, and he takes his tattered army north. Then, as his biographers note, on the 13th of May, 1781, Cornwallis crossed his Rubicon, the Roanoke River.